Can a life lived in solitude truly be lonely? Or does the vast embrace of the wild fill every empty space? Old Silas, a forester who had seen 70 winters come and go, was as much a part of the sprawling North American woods as the ancient oaks themselves. His presence was not just tolerated by the forest, it was woven into its very fabric, like the moss that clung to the northern sides of trees or the silent, persistent flow of the rivers. His small cabin, a structure of rough-hewn logs and a perpetually smoking chimney, was nestled deep in the rugged terrain, a testament to a life lived in a profound, unyielding harmony with nature. It stood on a rise overlooking a meandering stream, its windows, small and square, peering out like watchful eyes over miles of pine and spruce. Silas knew every winding trail, every subtle animal track etched into the damp earth, and the nuanced shift of the seasons in his bones. He could predict a coming snowstorm by the way the wind rustled through the topmost branches of the maples, or tell if a bear had passed by the faint scent of pine resin on a broken twig. His days unfolded with a quiet rhythm, a predictable cycle of patrolling the vast acreage under his care, mending fences that marked old property lines, observing the delicate balance of predator and prey, and occasionally felling a diseased tree to prevent the spread of blight. He was a quiet guardian. His hands, though gnarled with age and work, moved with a gentle precision, whether he was sharpening an axe or mending a torn piece of canvas. There was a slight hitch in his left knee, a memento from a fall many autumns ago, but it did not slow his deliberate pace. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, often directed at the rustling leaves or the distant call of a hawk, more a conversation with the forest itself than with any human. His eyes, the color of a clear lake, held a deep, unshakable wisdom, constantly scanning, interpreting the silent language of the wild. He wore the same sturdy, earth-toned clothes day after day, their fabrics softened by countless washes and imbued with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. One late autumn afternoon, the air still heavy with the damp aftermath of a particularly harsh storm, Silas was on a routine patrol. The storm had swept through with a raw, unforgiving fury, tearing at the canopy and leaving a trail of broken branches and uprooted saplings. The sky, a bruised purple-gray, promised more cold. The ground underfoot was a treacherous mix of mud and fallen leaves, slick and uneven. He was checking the traps he'd set for mink along the river bend, his mind focused on the practicalities of survival and the subtle shifts in the forest's pulse. Suddenly, a faint, almost imperceptible whimpering sound, carried on a gust of wind, snagged his attention. It was not the cry of a bird, nor the rustle of a squirrel. It was something more primal, more desperate. Following the sound, which grew steadily clearer as he pushed through a thicket of tangled underbrush, he stumbled upon a den. Its entrance, usually a discreet burrow under the roots of an ancient cedar, was partially collapsed, a heavy limb from a storm-felled tree having crushed the earth above it. Inside, nestled amidst the debris and exposed to the biting wind, was a single, tiny bundle of gray fur. A wolf cub, no older than a few weeks, its eyes barely open, shivered uncontrollably. Its small body was racked with cold, and its whimpers were thin, reedy pleas for warmth and comfort. The cub's mother was nowhere to be found. No scent, no track, likely lost to the storm's fury or driven away by its chaos. Silas, a man of deep, abiding empathy, looked at the helpless creature, its fragile existence hanging by a thread. He knew, with an instinct as old as the forest itself, that he couldn't leave it to perish. To abandon it would be to abandon a piece of the very wild he had sworn to protect. The decision was not a choice, but an imperative, a silent command from his own heart. Silas gently scooped up the cub, its tiny body surprisingly light in his calloused hands. The warmth of his palm seemed to offer the creature a flicker of hope, and its whimpering softened, replaced by a weak, almost imperceptible purr. The journey back to his cabin was slow, each step measured and careful, the precious cargo held close to his chest, shielded from the relentless wind. He named the cub Shadow, a name that felt fitting for a creature born of the forest's twilight and destined to move through its depths unseen. Initially, Shadow's existence was fragile, a delicate balance on the edge of survival. The cub was small, vulnerable, a tiny, shivering creature dependent entirely on Silas's care. The first few nights were spent coaxing warm milk into its reluctant mouth, holding it close to the crackling hearth and murmuring soft, comforting words that the cub, perhaps, understood more through tone than meaning. Silas fashioned a soft bed of old flannel shirts near the fire, a sanctuary of warmth and security. He watched over Shadow with a patience that only years of living in the unhurried pace of the wilderness could cultivate. Slowly, painstakingly, Shadow began to thrive. Its whimpers gave way to contented sighs, its shivers to playful wiggles. Its small, amber eyes, once clouded with fear, began to reflect a nascent curiosity and a growing trust. An unspoken pact formed between the old man and the young wolf, a bond woven not from words, but from shared solitude and mutual respect. Shadow, though growing larger and stronger with each passing week, never forgot the hands that had saved him, the quiet presence that offered warmth and sustenance. He would follow Silas like, well, a shadow, a silent, gray companion padding softly through the cabin, then venturing cautiously into the familiar woods. Silas, in turn, found a new depth in his solitary life, a companionship that was as wild and free as the forest itself, yet fiercely loyal. He would watch Shadow with a faint, knowing smile, observing its instincts sharpen, its movements grow more graceful. There was an understanding between them, a silent communication of glances and subtle shifts in posture, a language older than words. As Rudyard Kipling once wrote, "The strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack." Several months later, as the vibrant hues of autumn began to paint the forest in fiery reds and burnished golds, Silas's son, David, arrived for his annual visit. The old forester had expected him, of course, the date circled on a well-worn calendar tacked to a log beam above his small cluttered desk. David's arrival was always an event, a jarring shift in the cabin's quiet rhythm. His sleek black SUV, a gleaming anomaly against the rustic backdrop, crunched over the gravel path leading to the cabin, its modern lines a stark contrast to the ancient trees that loomed around it. The scent of gasoline and new tires briefly overpowered the familiar aromas of pine, wood smoke, and damp earth. David, a man of 45, emerged from the vehicle, his sharp-suited figure momentarily out of place amidst the wilderness. His dark, tailored jacket, though practical for travel, felt stiff and formal in this environment. He carried a leather briefcase, an emblem of his city life, and his expression, usually one of focused intensity, softened slightly as he took in the familiar, yet ever alien, sight of his father's domain. He was a successful architect, accustomed to the precise angles of skyscrapers and the controlled chaos of urban planning. His world was one of blueprints, deadlines, and carefully calculated risks, a universe away from the organic, unpredictable flow of the forest. He loved his father, in his own way, but found Silas's deepening connection to the wild increasingly perplexing, a charming but ultimately impractical eccentricity that bordered on stubborn refusal to engage with modern life. As David stepped onto the porch, a low growl rumbled from the shadows by the hearth. His eyes, sharp and accustomed to discerning details in architectural plans, narrowed with a mixture of disbelief and immediate disapproval. Curled by the warmth of the fire, a creature of sleek gray fur, now undeniably an adolescent wolf, lifted its head. Shadow, no longer the whimpering cub, but a creature of nascent power and wild grace, fixed David with an intense, unblinking gaze. Its amber eyes, intelligent and wary, held a silent challenge. The air in the cabin, usually peaceful, filled with the comforting scent of wood smoke and Silas's pipe tobacco, grew thick with an unspoken tension, a palpable clash of two worlds. "Father, what in the world have you done?" David exclaimed, his voice betraying a mix of shock and exasperation, the words cutting through the cabin's quiet like a sharp saw. He gestured toward Shadow with a dismissive, almost disgusted wave of his hand, as if the wolf were a particularly unsanitary piece of furniture. "It's a wild animal, a wolf. You can't domesticate a wolf. It's dangerous, unpredictable. It'll turn on you the moment its instincts kick in, the first time it smells blood or feels threatened." He let out a short, dry, humorless laugh, a sound that grated on Silas's ears. It was the laugh of a man who saw only folly in what he considered his father's foolish sentimentality, a man utterly unable to comprehend the quiet, profound understanding that had blossomed between the old forester and the young wolf.
David saw only the untamed predator, a threat, a ticking time bomb, not the loyal companion Silas had nurtured. Silas, who had been meticulously cleaning his rifle, merely shook his head, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips, a smile that held the patience of all the years he had spent observing the forest's intricate dance. He laid the rifle carefully on the table and turned to face his son, his gaze steady and calm. "You don't understand, David. Shadow isn't a pet. He's a part of this place, just like me. He knows loyalty, perhaps better than some men." His words, spoken with calm conviction, carried the weight of a lifetime spent in quiet communion with the natural world. But to David, they only seemed to fuel his skepticism, further cementing his belief that his father was growing increasingly detached from reality, his mind perhaps softened by too much solitude and too little practical interaction with the real world. David scoffed, running a hand through his neatly trimmed, slightly graying hair. "Loyalty? Father, it's a creature of pure instinct. It sees you as a food source, a provider. The moment that changes, the moment it's hungry enough or frightened enough, it will revert to its true nature. You're living in a fantasy, an old man's dream. What if it attacks a hiker? What if it bites a child? You could face serious consequences. This isn't some stray dog from the shelter." He paced the small cabin, his city-bred energy ill-contained by its rustic confines. Think of the liability, the sheer irresponsibility of it. Silas watched him, his smile fading into a look of quiet resignation. He had tried to explain this many times before, in different contexts, about his choice to live simply, about his work as a forester, about his philosophy of respecting the wild rather than conquering it. David always saw the risks, the inefficiencies, the lack of progress. "Shadow has never shown aggression, David, not to me, not to anyone who has come here. He knows the difference between friend and foe. He is part of this home, just as much as the wood in these walls." He gestured around the cabin, indicating the very essence of his existence. His nature is not simply wild beast. It is complex, capable of deep bonds if given the chance. The argument, or rather the monologue from David and the patient, almost silent rebuttal from Silas, continued for the better part of the evening. David enumerated all the reasons why keeping a wolf was not only dangerous, but illogical. The potential for disease, the legal ramifications, the ethical questions of interfering with a wild animal's life, the sheer foolishness of inviting such unpredictability into one's home. He spoke of progress, of civilization, of man's rightful place at the top of the food chain, controlling nature, not befriending its most fearsome predators. Silas listened, occasionally offering a soft counterpoint, a gentle anecdote about Shadow's intelligence or his surprisingly gentle nature. Shadow, meanwhile, lay by the hearth, seemingly asleep, but his ears twitched, his tail gave a subtle thump against the floorboards when Silas spoke, and his eyes, though half closed, remained fixed on David, an ancient, knowing glint within their depths. The wolf seemed to understand the tenor of the conversation, the underlying tension, the chasm between father and son. As days turned into a week, a brooding silence, heavier than the usual forest quiet, hung between father and son.
David continued his attempts to convince Silas to do the sensible thing, to call animal control, to release Shadow back into the wild, though he privately believed the wolf was now too accustomed to humans to truly survive. Silas remained unyielding, his quiet conviction a rock against David's relentless waves of logic. Shadow, always near Silas, seemed to sense the discord, his usual playful nudges replaced by a more watchful, almost protective presence.
He would often rest his head on Silas's knee, his gaze shifting from the old man to David, as if trying to decipher the human conflict. Then, the sky began to churn. It was a late-season blizzard, unusually fierce for so early in the winter, a meteorological anomaly that descended upon the forest with brutal, unexpected speed. The morning had dawned clear and crisp, a deceptive calm before the storm. By midday, a faint, almost ethereal haze had begun to obscure the distant peaks. Silas, with his innate understanding of the forest's moods, had felt it first, a subtle shift in the wind's breath, a peculiar stillness in the air, an electric charge that prickled his skin. "Looks like we're in for a real blow, David," he'd remarked, his voice low, a note of concern in it. David, checking his phone for a signal that rarely materialized, had merely grunted, dismissing it as another of his father's old wives' tales. But by early afternoon, the sky had transformed into a menacing canvas of bruised purples and ominous grays. The first snowflakes, large and heavy, began to fall, not gently, but with a fierce, almost aggressive intent. The wind, initially a whisper, quickly escalated into a howl, a banshee's shriek tearing through the skeletal branches of the deciduous trees and rattling the stout pines. Snow fell in blinding sheets, a thick, swirling curtain that rapidly consumed the familiar landscape. Within an hour, the world outside the cabin's windows had become a treacherous, white expanse, every landmark erased, every trail obliterated. The temperature plummeted, a bitter cold that seeped into the very bones. Silas and David, caught far from the cabin, on what was meant to be a routine check of the traps Silas had set near a distant ridge, were suddenly in grave peril. They had ventured out that morning, David reluctantly accompanying his father, still hoping to persuade him to abandon his primitive ways. The snow had begun to fall while they were already deep in the woods, too far to simply turn back. The initial dusting had seemed manageable, but the blizzard's ferocity had escalated with terrifying speed, trapping them in its swirling vortex. Visibility dropped to mere feet, the wind-driven snow stinging their faces like 1,000 tiny needles. Shadow, who had been trotting silently behind them, his gray fur almost perfectly camouflaged against the falling flakes, now pressed closer to Silas, his instincts sensing the profound danger. The storm's ferocity was overwhelming, a primal force that dwarfed their human existence. Every gust of wind was a physical blow, threatening to knock them off their feet. The trees around them groaned and creaked, their ancient trunks swaying precariously. Then, with a deafening crack that reverberated through the blizzard's roar, a massive pine, weakened by age and the relentless wind, began to topple. It was a slow-motion horror, the sound of splintering wood echoing in the whiteout. David, disoriented and struggling against the wind, stumbled. Silas, with a lifetime of instinct guiding him, reacted instantly. With a surge of strength that belied his 70 years, he shoved David violently out of the path of the falling giant. David tumbled into a snowdrift, momentarily stunned. The pine crashed down with a thunderous impact, narrowly missing David, but striking Silas. He lay twisted amidst the snow and debris, his leg clearly broken, a jagged, unnatural angle visible even through the thick fabric of his trousers. A searing pain, sharp and immediate, shot through him, followed quickly by a dull, throbbing ache that radiated through his entire body. Hypothermia, insidious and swift, began to set in almost immediately, the bitter cold already numbing his extremities, threatening to claim him. David, despite his earlier dismissiveness, felt a surge of raw, unadulterated panic.
The intellectual arguments, the urban pragmatism, the scoffing skepticism, all vanished in an instant, replaced by a visceral terror. His father, his anchor to this wild world, lay broken and fading. They were miles from the cabin, lost in a swirling, featureless whiteout, visibility zero. The realization of their dire situation hit him with the force of a physical blow. He scrambled to his father's side, his hands fumbling, useless against the immense weight of the fallen tree and the sheer force of the storm. He tried desperately to move Silas, to drag him clear of the debris, but the conditions were impossible. The snow was too deep, his father too heavy, the pain in Silas's leg too excruciating to allow any movement. David's own hands were numb, his fingers clumsy with cold, his breath ragged and turning to icy plumes in the frigid air. He shouted into the wind, his voice raw with fear and desperation, but his cries were swallowed by the storm's relentless roar, lost in the vast, indifferent wilderness. Shadow, who had been trotting silently behind them, a vigilant presence, now circled frantically. Its gray fur, usually a subtle camouflage, was almost invisible against the blinding white of the snow, a phantom moving through the blizzard. The wolf whined, a low, guttural sound of distress, nudging Silas with its nose, then turning its head to look at David, its amber eyes wide with an urgent intelligence. David looked at the wolf, a flicker of desperate, illogical hope igniting within him, quickly followed by despair. What could a wild animal, a creature of instinct, do against such a force? What use was a wolf against the unforgiving power of a blizzard? His rational mind screamed that they were doomed. Just as David felt all hope drain away, a cold, heavy stone settling in his chest, Shadow did the impossible. Instead of fleeing for self-preservation, a natural instinct for any wild creature facing such a threat, the wolf nudged Silas again, more insistently this time, a gentle but firm pressure against the old man's cheek. Then it barked sharply at David, not with aggression or fear, but with an insistent urgency, a clear command in its tone. It turned and with a swift, purposeful gait began to push its way through the deepening snow, its powerful legs churning through the drifts. It glanced back repeatedly, its intelligent eyes meeting David's, as if urging him, pleading with him to follow. It was leading him, not randomly, not in a panicked flight, but with a clear, almost uncanny sense of direction, through the blinding blizzard, towards something only it seemed to know. The wolf's movements were not those of a frightened animal, but of a guide, a protector. Against all logic, against every rational thought that screamed at him to stay put, to conserve energy, to wait for an impossible rescue, David followed. He had no other choice. His father's life depended on it. He half-carried, half-dragged Silas, gritting his teeth against the effort, the cold, and the despair, trusting the wolf's lead. Shadow plunged ahead, its powerful body breaking a path through the thigh-deep snow, its gray form appearing and disappearing in the swirling white. They moved through a forgotten, snow-choked trail, a path that Silas might have used decades ago, but that David had never known existed, past treacherous drifts that threatened to swallow them whole. Shadow never wavered, its pace steady, its determination absolute. Minutes stretched into an eternity. David's muscles screamed, his lungs burned, and his vision blurred with exertion and the constant assault of the snow. He stumbled, fell, and picked himself up again, driven by a primal fear and the silent, unwavering presence of the wolf ahead. Shadow plunged ahead, its powerful body breaking a path through the thigh-deep snow, its gray form appearing and disappearing in the swirling white. They moved through a forgotten, snow-choked trail, a path that Silas might have used decades ago, but that David had never known existed, past treacherous drifts that threatened to swallow them whole. Shadow never wavered, its pace steady, its determination absolute. Minutes stretched into an eternity. David's muscles screamed, his lungs burned, and his vision blurred with exertion and the constant assault of the snow. He stumbled, fell, and picked himself up again, driven by a primal fear and the silent, unwavering presence of the wolf ahead. Just when he thought he could take no more,
When the icy grip of hypothermia threatened to claim him too, Shadow stopped. It whined softly, nudging its head towards a barely discernible mound of snow-covered logs. It was a tiny, long-abandoned trapper's cabin, a crude, forgotten shelter that Silas had mentioned once, a distant memory David had dismissed as insignificant, a relic of a bygone era. Inside, though crude and long neglected, it offered a miraculous, life-saving refuge from the storm. The air, though frigid, was still, offering a blessed respite from the howling wind. David, his hands shaking uncontrollably, managed to drag Silas inside, collapsing beside him. With numb fingers, he fumbled for the emergency matches Silas always carried, and with a desperate effort, managed to start a small fire in the cabin's rudimentary stone hearth. Feeding it with dried kindling and broken branches, Shadow had somehow located and nudged towards the entrance. The warmth, slow at first, then gradually stronger, began to seep back into his father's frozen limbs, a fragile promise of survival. Shadow, after ensuring they were safely inside, curled up protectively beside Silas, its powerful body a living shield against the cold, its watchful eyes never leaving the old man. As dawn broke, casting a pale, weak light over the snow-covered forest, painting the world in shades of soft gray and pristine white, David looked at Shadow, curled protectively beside his father, with an entirely new understanding. The wolf had not just led them to safety, it had shattered his cynical, city-bred worldview into 1,000 pieces. In that moment, David saw not a wild beast, not a dangerous predator, but a loyal companion, a guardian whose love and instinct had accomplished what human reason, for all its supposed superiority, could not. The bond between his father and Shadow was real, powerful, and utterly profound.
It transcended species, logic, and the very definitions of family David had always known. He felt a profound sense of humility, a shame for his earlier scorn, and a burgeoning respect for the silent wisdom of the wild. His father, the old forester, had been right all along. The forest held secrets and truths that the city could never comprehend, and some of the deepest loyalties were forged not in words, but in shared moments of vulnerability and the unspoken language of the heart. The wolf, the very creature he had dismissed, had saved them, proving a devotion that defied every one of David's preconceived notions. The pale, weak light of dawn, filtering through the snow-laden pines, painted the crude interior of the trapper's cabin in shades of soft gray and pristine white. David, stiff and aching from the night's ordeal, watched Shadow. The wolf lay curled tightly against Silas's side, a living blanket of gray fur, its rhythmic breathing a quiet counterpoint to the old man's shallow, pain-filled gasps. The image was etched into David's mind, replacing the sharp-suited pragmatism he usually wore like a second skin. His initial fear had given way to a profound awe, then to a creeping sense of shame. He had judged, dismissed, and ridiculed, blind to a truth that now shone with the clarity of the morning sun on fresh snow. He remembered the early days of Shadow's presence, the quiet moments his father had shared, which David had brushed off as sentimental folly. Silas would often sit by the fire, a hand resting gently on Shadow's head, murmuring softly about the forest's secrets, about the interconnectedness of all living things. David had seen only a man talking to an animal, a sign of his father's increasing isolation. He recalled one evening, months ago, when he'd observed Silas teaching Shadow to fetch a dropped glove, not with commands, but with patient gestures and soft encouragement, as if engaging in a silent, mutual understanding.
Shadow, then a gangly adolescent, had brought it back, not with the eager pant of a dog, but with a quiet dignity, laying it at Silas's feet before retreating to his usual spot by the hearth. David had scoffed then, muttering about conditioning and Pavlovian responses. Now he understood it was something far deeper, a communication beyond words, forged in trust and shared existence. The hours they spent trapped in that tiny cabin, waiting for the storm to abate, became a crucible for David's transformation.
He tended to his father as best he could, fashioning a makeshift splint for Silas's leg from 2 sturdy branches and strips of his own torn jacket. He kept the fire burning, its warmth a constant battle against the encroaching cold. Shadow remained a constant, vigilant presence. It would occasionally rise, stretch its powerful limbs, and then settle back down, always close to Silas, its amber eyes tracking David's every move, not with hostility, but with a quiet, assessing intelligence. David found himself speaking to the wolf, at first tentatively, then with growing ease, explaining his actions, his fears. "I need to check on him, boy," he'd whisper, reaching for Silas's forehead, and Shadow would shift slightly, allowing him access. There was no growl, no snap, only a silent acknowledgement. He watched Shadow's subtle interactions with Silas, the way the wolf would lick the old man's hand or gently nudge his face when Silas stirred in pain. It was not the fawning affection of a domesticated dog, but a deep, protective tenderness, an understanding of vulnerability. David began to see the world through his father's eyes, or perhaps through Shadow's. He noticed the minute shifts in the blizzard's intensity, the subtle changes in the wind's pitch, the way the light altered as the storm began its slow retreat. He realized that his father's eccentricities were not a detachment from reality, but a profound immersion in a different, equally valid reality. As the second day wore on, and the storm finally began to break, leaving behind a world of pristine, dazzling white, David found himself observing Shadow with a new reverence. He remembered the terrifying moments in the blizzard, the feeling of utter helplessness, the certainty of their demise. He replayed Shadow's actions, the urgent bark, the purposeful turn, the unwavering lead through an invisible path. How had the wolf known about the trapper's cabin? Silas, in a moment of lucidity, had explained that wolves often knew of such forgotten shelters, their keen senses picking up faint human scents or structural anomalies in the landscape, remembering them as potential havens. It was not just instinct, but an ancient, inherited knowledge of the land, a wisdom that far surpassed David's urban logic.